Welcome. You're standing in Versailles in 1682 and you're looking at the largest palace in Europe. This is not a residence. This is a machine for creating absolute power. Louis XIV, the Sun King, built this, not to live comfortably, not to display wealth, but to control France by controlling the French nobility. Every room is a statement, every ritual is theater, every moment is choreographed. The palace covers 721,000 square feet. The gardens span 2,000 acres, over 700 rooms, 2,300 windows, 200 fireplaces. At its peak, 20,000 people live and work here. Nobles, servants, guards, courtiers, ministers, priests, musicians, gardeners, cooks. An entire society contained within gates. This is Versailles, and it was designed to be a prison disguised as paradise. Louis XIV was born in 1638. He became king at age 4 when his father, Louis XIII, died. His mother, Anne of Austria, ruled as regent. Cardinal Mazarin, her advisor and possibly her lover, held actual power. Louis was king in name only, a child dressed in royal robes while adults made decisions. In 1648, when Louis was 10, France exploded. The Fronde, a civil war, nobles rebelling against royal authority, mobs in Paris, the royal family forced to flee the capital in the middle of the night. Louis never forgot this. The terror of being powerless, the humiliation of nobles defying their king, the chaos of a monarchy that couldn't control its own aristocracy. These memories shaped everything he built. The Fronde ended in 1653. Mazarin restored order. Louis remained technically king, but Mazarin still ruled. Louis learned by watching. He learned that nobles were dangerous when they had independent power bases. He learned that Paris was unstable. He learned that controlling information and access meant controlling people. In 1661, Mazarin died. Louis was 22. He called a council meeting and announced he would rule personally. No chief minister, no regent. He would be king, in fact, not just title. The nobles were shocked. French kings had always relied on ministers. Louis would not. This was the beginning. Versailles started as a hunting lodge. Louis XIII built it in 1623, a small chateau in a swampy area 12 miles from Paris. Nothing impressive. Louis XIV loved hunting there as a young man. It was private, removed from Paris, removed from the nobles who had humiliated him during the Fronde. In 1661, he began expanding it. Modestly at first, a larger chateau, better accommodations. Then the vision grew. By 1668, he decided Versailles would replace Paris as the center of French power. This was revolutionary. Kings lived in their capitals. They lived near their nobles. Louis would do the opposite. He would create a new capital, and he would force the nobles to come to him. The architect was Louis Levaux, later Jules Ardouin-Mansart. The landscape architect was André Lenotre, who had designed the gardens at Vaux-le-Vicomte for Nicolas Fouquet, Louis's finance minister. Fouquet made a mistake. In 1661, he threw a party at Vaux-le-Vicomte to honor the king. The chateau was magnificent. The gardens were perfect. The entertainment was lavish. Fouquet wanted to impress Louis. He succeeded too well. Louis saw Vaux-le-Vicomte and realized his finance minister had built something more beautiful than any royal palace. 3 weeks later, Fouquet was arrested for embezzlement. He spent the rest of his life in prison. Louis took Fouquet's architects, his designers, his vision. He would build something that made Vaux-le-Vicomte look like a cottage. That something was Versailles. Construction never stopped. For 50 years, from 1661 to 1711, Versailles was under constant expansion. Workers numbered between 30,000 and 40,000 at peak times. They worked in shifts, day and night. The cost was staggering. Exact figures were kept secret, even from Louis's own ministers. Estimates suggest Versailles consumed between 1/4 and 1/2 of France's annual revenue during peak construction years. The money came from taxes, peasants paid, Louis built. The marshland had to be drained, The ground was unstable. Workers died from malaria, from accidents, from exhaustion. The dead were replaced. No one knows the exact death toll. Hundreds, certainly, possibly thousands. The ground beneath Versailles is filled with bodies. The palace that emerged was designed for control, not comfort. The Hall of Mirrors is the centerpiece, 240 feet long, 357 mirrors covering one wall. In the 17th century, mirrors were among the most expensive objects you could own. Venetian glassmakers had a monopoly. Louis broke it by smuggling Venetian craftsmen to France and establishing a French mirror industry. The Hall of Mirrors was a political statement. France didn't need Venice. France could make anything. The hall was used for ceremonies, receptions, displays of power. Foreign ambassadors walked its length under Louis's gaze. The mirrors reflected everything. You couldn't hide. You were always seen. The state apartments were a series of rooms dedicated to planets. The salon of Apollo for the Sun, the salon of Mercury, the salon of Mars, each room more elaborate than the last. Painted ceilings by Charles Lebrun depicting Louis as Apollo, as a Roman emperor, as a god. This wasn't metaphor. Louis believed in the divine right of kings. God chose monarchs. To oppose the king was to oppose God. The decorations reinforced this constantly. Everywhere you looked, Louis was elevated, glorified, deified. The message was relentless. Louis's bedroom was at the exact center of the palace, aligned with the sun's east-west axis. This was deliberate. Louis was the sun. The palace was built around him. His daily routine became public ceremony. The lever, his morning rising, and the coucher, his evening retirement, were attended by hundreds of nobles. They stood in his bedroom watching him wake, watching him dress, watching him pray. Attendance was mandatory for high-ranking nobles. It was an honor to hand the king his shirt. It was an honor to hold the candle while he undressed. The intimacy was a weapon. Louis made the nobles serve him personally. He reduced them from independent lords to glorified valets. The etiquette was suffocating. Rules governed everything. Who could sit in the king's presence? Who could knock on doors? Who could stand where during ceremonies? Who could wear hats indoors? The rules were complex, arbitrary, constantly changing. Learning them required full-time attention. Following them required constant vigilance. This was the point. Nobles spent their energy on etiquette instead of plotting rebellion. They competed for meaningless honors instead of building independent power. Louis created a system where status was determined entirely by proximity to him. Your importance was measured by whether you attended the lever, whether you dined with the king, whether you walked with him in the gardens. Nothing else mattered. The result was that French nobles abandoned their estates and moved to Versailles. They had to. If you weren't at court, you were invisible. If you were invisible, you lost influence. If you lost influence, your rivals gained it. So they came. They brought their families. They rented or built accommodations near the palace. They attended ceremonies. They followed Louis through the gardens. They watched him eat. They competed for his attention. And while they did this, they weren't in their provinces raising armies. They weren't building alliances. They weren't threatening the crown. They were domesticated, controlled, neutralized. Louis married Marie-Thérèse of Spain in 1660 for political reasons. He never loved her. She gave him 6 children. Only one survived to adulthood. Louis was unfaithful constantly. His mistresses were part of the court: Louise de la Vallière, Madame de Montespan, later Madame de Maintenon, whom he probably married secretly after Marie-Thérèse died. The mistresses had apartments in the palace, they attended ceremonies, they had influence. Marie-Thérèse was humiliated publicly and continuously. She had no power to stop it. She died in 1683, saying her only regret was that she hadn't made Louis happy. The cruelty was casual. Louis was king. He did what he wanted. The court was a theater of performance. Every action was public. Louis ate most meals surrounded by observers. Courtiers stood and watched him eat. This was entertainment. The king's dinner was an event. He ate elaborately, multiple courses, dozens of dishes. He ate quickly. Everything had to be choreographed. The servants who brought the food walked in procession, the guards who protected the food, the tasters who checked for poison, the nobles who had the honor of presenting dishes. It was a ballet of power, repeated daily. The gardens were as controlled as the palace. Le Nôtre designed them in the formal French style, geometric, symmetrical. Nature dominated completely, trees planted in rows, hedges trimmed into shapes, fountains arranged in patterns. The gardens covered 2,000 acres. They required 1 to 400 fountains. The water system was the most complex in Europe. Aqueducts, reservoirs, pumps. The problem was that Versailles had no natural water source. The nearest river was miles away. The engineers built the Machine de Marly, an enormous pumping system with 14 water wheels, 221 pumps, lifting water from the Seine 530 feet upward, then pushing it miles to Versailles. It was the largest mechanical system in the world at the time. It barely worked. The fountains could only run for a few hours. When Louis walked in the gardens, servants would run ahead and turn on the fountains in his path, then turn them off after he passed to conserve water. Even the fountains were theater. The cost of maintaining Versailles was ruinous. The palace required 3,000 to 5,000 servants just to function. Cooks, cleaners, gardeners, fountain operators, guards, stable workers, musicians, priests. They all needed housing, food, wages. The court consumed food at an industrial scale. Hundreds of nobles dining daily, guests constantly, feasts for special occasions. The kitchens were enormous. The waste was staggering. Meanwhile, France's peasants were starving. Famines struck regularly. 1693-1694 killed between 1 and 2 million people. Louis didn't reduce court expenses. Versailles continued. The contrast was obscene. The military campaigns drained France further. Louis fought almost constantly. The War of Devolution, the Franco-Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession. He wanted to expand France's borders, secure his dynasty, establish French dominance in Europe. The wars were expensive and mostly unsuccessful. France won some territory but exhausted itself financially. By the end of Louis's reign, France was bankrupt. The debt was massive. The tax base was destroyed. The wars had achieved little, but Versailles still stood. Louis prioritized the palace over everything. The chapel at Versailles was completed in 1710, 9 years before Louis died. It was the final major addition, 2 stories. The king sat on the upper level, the court below. Even in prayer, hierarchy was maintained. Louis attended Mass daily. This was performance too. Public piety. The king as God's representative on earth. The chapel was beautiful. White marble, gold leaf, painted ceilings. But it was also propaganda. Everything at Versailles was propaganda. The nobles trapped at Versailles were financially ruined by their attendance. Living at court was expensive. You needed appropriate clothing, appropriate gifts, appropriate entertainment. You needed to gamble because Louis gambled and you had to participate. You needed servants of your own because appearing without retinue was shameful. Many nobles went into debt maintaining appearances. This also served Louis. A noble in debt couldn't fund a rebellion. They needed royal pensions. They needed appointments to paid positions. They needed the king's favor. So they stayed, they performed, they competed, they ruined themselves. The women at court were decorative and disposable. They could influence through relationships with powerful men, but they had no formal power. They attended ceremonies, they gambled, they gossiped. They competed for the king's attention or for positions as ladies-in-waiting to the queen or the mistresses. Some were educated, many were intelligent. But the system gave them no outlet except manipulation and performance. The court consumed them as it consumed everyone. Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685. This edict had granted limited religious freedom to French Protestants, the Huguenots. Louis wanted religious unity. One king, one law, one faith. The revocation forced Huguenots to convert to Catholicism or flee. Hundreds of thousands fled. They took skills, capital, knowledge to France's enemies. Protestant countries welcomed them. France lost some of its most productive citizens. The economic damage was severe. But Louis believed religious unity was worth any cost. He saw himself as God's warrior. The Protestant heresy had to be eliminated. The king aged. By the 1690s, Louis was in his 50s. The constant wars, the elaborate lifestyle, the pressure of maintaining absolute control were exhausting. He became more religious, more rigid. Madame de Maintenon influenced him toward piety. The court became more restrained, less gambling, less overt debauchery. But the system continued. The lever, the cowsher, the ceremonies, the etiquette. Louis couldn't stop. Stopping would mean admitting the performance was meaningless. And if the performance was meaningless, what was Versailles? Personal tragedy accumulated. Louis's son, the Grand Dauphin, died in 1711, then his grandson in 1712, then his great-grandson in 1714. 3 generations of heirs died within 3 years. The succession was in chaos. Louis's great-great-grandson, a child of 5, was the only direct heir left. This child would become Louis XV. But Louis XIV knew he wouldn't live to see the boy grow up. Everything he built depended on a 5-year-old child surviving and maintaining the system. It was precarious. Louis XIV died in 1715 at age 76. He had reigned for 72 years, the longest reign of any European monarch up to that point. His final words reportedly were, "I am going, but France remains." But the France he left was broken. Massive debt, lost wars, religious division, resentful nobles, exhausted peasants, and Versailles. The palace stood as his monument, the physical embodiment of absolute monarchy, complete, excessive, unsustainable. The regency under Philippe d'Orléans moved the court back to Paris. Versailles was abandoned temporarily. The nobles fled gladly. The palace that had imprisoned them was suddenly empty. But Louis XV, when he came of age, returned to Versailles. He continued the system. Lesser in scale, less grandiose, but fundamentally the same. Versailles remained the center of French power. The nobles returned, the ceremonies continued, the machine kept running. Louis XVI, the final king of the Ancien Régime, lived at Versailles until the French Revolution forced him back to Paris in 1789. The revolutionaries saw Versailles as everything wrong with the monarchy: excess, privilege, disconnection from the people. They considered demolishing it. But the cost of destruction was too high. Instead, they emptied it. The furniture was auctioned. The art was moved to museums. The palace became a shell. Napoleon had no interest in Versailles. He preferred smaller, more practical palaces. The Bourbon Restoration in 1814 didn't fully revive Versailles either. The world had changed. The age of absolute monarchy was over. Louis Philippe, the citizen king, saved Versailles by converting it into a museum in 1837. To all the glories of France, a museum of French history. The palace that had been built for one man's absolute power became a monument to the nation. The irony was total. Today, Versailles receives over 10 million visitors annually. It's one of the most visited sites in France. The tourists see the Hall of Mirrors and imagine parties. They see the state apartments and think of luxury. They walk the gardens and appreciate the beauty. What they don't see is the system, the control, the trap. Versailles was never about beauty. It was about power. Every mirror, every fountain, every ceremony, every rule was designed to make absolute monarchy function by making nobles irrelevant. The palace is preserved meticulously now. Restoration is constant. The French government spends millions annually maintaining it. The Hall of Mirrors gleams. The gardens are perfect. The fountains, finally with reliable water, run on schedule. Tourists can attend the musical fountain show, where the fountains operate to Baroque music. The experience is beautiful and completely divorced from the original purpose. The fountains weren't built for beauty. They were built to demonstrate that Louis could make water flow uphill through sheer will and engineering. They were power made visible. The guides tell you about Louis's daily routine, the lever, the grand couvert where he dined in public, the hunting expeditions. They frame it as fascinating history. They don't emphasize that every ritual was a chain, that attending the king's bedtime wasn't an honor but a requirement, that nobles who failed to attend lost status and therefore power, that the entire system was designed to keep the aristocracy busy with meaningless tasks while Louis ruled unchallenged. The cost of Versailles in human terms is incalculable. The workers who died building it, the nobles who bankrupted themselves maintaining appearances, the mistresses who were used and discarded, the queen who was publicly humiliated, the servants who worked invisible, endless labor, the peasants who paid taxes to fund a palace they would never see while they starved. All of this to serve one man's vision of absolute monarchy. But Louis's vision worked. For his lifetime, it worked perfectly. He controlled France more completely than any previous French king. He made the nobility powerless. He centralized authority absolutely. He created a system that survived him by decades. Versailles was the machine that made absolutism function. It was never meant to be efficient or sustainable. It was meant to be overwhelming. And it was. The palace is beautiful, undeniably beautiful. The Hall of Mirrors is breathtaking. The gardens are masterpieces. The art, the architecture, the craftsmanship, all are extraordinary. This is the paradox. Something can be beautiful and evil. It can be an achievement and a monument to oppression. Versailles is both. It represents the peak of French artistic achievement and the peak of French monarchical excess. It's a masterpiece built on suffering. Walk through Versailles today and you walk through a ghost palace. The rooms are empty of life. The furniture is roped off. The state apartments echo. The Hall of Mirrors is crowded with tourists taking selfies, but it's empty of power. The machine is off. The system is gone. What remains is architecture. Magnificent, excessive, empty architecture. A monument to one man's belief that he was the sun and everything else revolved around him. Louis XIV built Versailles to be eternal, to outlast him, to prove that absolute monarchy was the natural order. He succeeded in the first goal. Versailles outlasted him. It outlasted the monarchy. It outlasted the empire. It outlasted everything. But he failed in the second. Absolute monarchy wasn't eternal. It was a phase. And Versailles, rather than proving monarchy's permanence, became evidence of its excess. The revolutionaries who stormed Versailles in 1789 saw the palace as proof that the monarchy was corrupt, wasteful, disconnected. They were right. What Versailles proves is that power can create beauty, that beauty can serve oppression, that systems of control can be elaborate, sophisticated, and still fundamentally about keeping people subjugated. Louis didn't need to use violence to control the nobles, though violence was always available. He used ritual, etiquette, access, proximity. He made submission the path to status. He made obedience the path to relevance. And it worked. The Sun King died believing he had secured France's future. He had built the greatest palace in Europe. He had reduced the nobility to courtiers. He had centralized all power in himself. But he left France bankrupt, exhausted, and resentful. 74 years after his death, revolutionaries would execute his great-great-great-grandson on the guillotine. The system Louis built died violently. Versailles survived only by ceasing to be what it was and becoming a museum, a monument, a warning. This is Versailles, not the palace, not the gardens, but the system. The machine for creating absolute power by controlling human behavior through architecture, ritual, and performance. Louis XIV built it because he remembered being a child king fleeing Paris in the night while nobles rebelled. He built it to ensure that could never happen again, and it didn't. During his lifetime, the nobles were controlled completely. After his death, the system collapsed, but the palace remains. 400 years later, tourists pay to walk through Louis's bedroom, to stand in the Hall of Mirrors, to see the gardens. They imagine the grandeur. They don't imagine the control. They see the beauty. They don't see the trap. Versailles is preserved and celebrated and visited and admired, and what it represents, what it actually was, is forgotten. A palace built to make one man the center of the universe, a machine that consumed the wealth of a nation to glorify a king who believed he was divine, beautiful, excessive, oppressive, real. The sun set on Louis XIV in 1715, but Versailles still stands, empty of power, full of tourists, a monument to the belief that one man could build himself into permanence. He couldn't. But the palace he built to try remains long after the system it served has vanished. Stone and glass and gold, carefully maintained, open for tours, daily, year-round, admission charged.